You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics this evening because we have as our guest David Hoffman, who is running for the U.S. Senate in the Democratic primary. Our regular viewers would know we tape in Skokie. A lot of our students come from New Trier. So there's that association with tonight's show because he is a New Trier High School grad back in '84, Yale University in 1988, University of Chicago Law School in '95. Took off some time to learn about politics, which might be helpful now as he gets into running in this race when he was working for Democratic Oklahoma Senator David Boren, and out of law school, clerking in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and then for Supreme Court Chief Justice Rehnquist, and your private sector practice, U.S. Attorney's Office, Assistant U.S. Attorney for 7 years, then Inspector General for the City of Chicago, and I guess that was a new office at the time, wasn't it?
It wasn't a new office, but there had been one Inspector General for 16 years, and I think once we made some changes, it felt like a new office.
You reshaped it?
I think we did reshape it, yeah, and made it into a real independent office that was, I think, seen as effective.
And you are a reformer. That's your reputation, partly from that office. Would you say mostly from that office, right?
I think that, and also being on the Illinois Reform Commission, which was the commission appointed after Governor Blagojevich was charged, and we were given the mission of traveling around the state and making recommendations about reforms in state government.
So as a reformer, you know, there's been a lot in the news. We're taping this on September 20th, the year 2009. You've just announced recently, was it the last week officially, running for the Senate? Yeah. Acorn's in the news. You know about Acorn?
Sure.
Was an association of community organizations for reform or something like that? And they're in the news because a videographer, might call him that, walked in, put on in one of their offices, was it in Brooklyn, was it in Baltimore, was it in Washington, I don't know, 2 or 3 other offices, the same kind of skit. They said they were there, one was, and the male said he had somebody with him who was a prostitute. They wanted assistance in getting a house for a brothel. There'd be underage prostitution going on, and Acorn said, here's how we can help you, essentially. Did I get that right?
I think so. I think they said, here's how we can help you to, I think they were giving advice about how to
get assistance from the government.
Law.
How to break the law and just get the government to fund that house, right? Okay, the U.S. Senate says they're going to vote no on future funding for Acorn. I think it was 83-7 vote. 2 Illinois senators were in that 7 who voted against defunding. That was for funding, if you want to put it that way. Durbin and Burris. In the House, it passed overwhelmingly to defund. The federal government has now severed relationships with Acorn for census work, right?
I believe so.
If you had been there, if you'd been in the Senate, where would you have been in terms of voting on funding or defunding for Acorn?
Yeah, I would have voted to defund. And I saw that in the House, the Illinois delegation was actually split. Some voted to defund, some did not. I think that accountability is important. And I think accountability is important whether it's people in the government, whether it's people who get governmental money, or whether it's folks in the private sector like important players on Wall Street. And I do think that I would have concerns about giving significant federal grant money to an entity where there now is strong evidence that one of the things I thought was compelling, that on 100% of the times that the videographer went in, they got consistent advice to do something that was violation of the law. So I don't think this is a permanent ban on Acorn getting funding, but I think until Acorn comes back and shows that it has put in place systems that are going to prevent this and ensure that it's a law-abiding place that gives out advice to follow the law, then I do think it's appropriate to take money away. I also think, though, that we need to hold that make that standard consistent across the board, and I think we may get into this later, but on issues of how Wall Street acted, for instance, and how the big financial institutions acted. When we see greed and irresponsibility that led to very major, basically the collapse of the banking industry that then fell on regular folks, both in terms of paying for the bailout and in layoffs and job losses. And Wall Street quickly going back to its same MO, both in terms of salaries and bonuses and in terms of activities with very little insistence on transparency or increased regulation. I see that as a problem too. And I think people want more accountability. Everyone's tight on money. Whether it's banks or the way our tax dollars are spent, we should demand it.
Well, if you had been in Congress, and you'd been in the Senate in the fall of 2008, when the President and the then Secretary Treasurer Paulson and Fed Chief Bernanke came, and I think Nancy Pelosi signed on to this $700 billion bailout, and they'd asked you if you would support that as a senator. Would you have supported the $700 billion bailout then?
I would have, but it was like having a gun held to your head at that point. I mean, basically, we were on the verge of a global economic collapse that would absolutely have rivaled the Great Depression. So we're already suffering through this incredibly deep recession. But I do believe that the problem was the way that the banks and Congress and the administration acted from the 2005 to 2007 period, when everything was going very, very well. And there was legislation on the table at times to increase the amount of oversight, increase the amount of regulation, and increase the amount of accountability for banks. Look, let's take a real easy aspect of this. Demanding more transparency in the way that banks act, whether it's in buying and selling these derivatives or something else. The banks lobbied hard to press against that and to defeat those measures. And they lobbied hard, including by giving a lot of campaign contributions. And they were successful. Much greater transparency and more independent oversight may well have made a difference and may not have resulted in the collapse we had.
Well, when you say more oversight, I mean, as you know, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were in trouble a long time before then, and they were bailed out, right?
They were.
They were bailed out by the government.
Right.
And there were people who wanted to, and there were Republicans who wanted to regulate them more, in a sense, who thought they were being too loose, giving out too many home loans, promoting ownership among people who really can't afford them. And as you know, there were Democrats, Dodd and Barney Frank, who opposed those increased regulations.
Well, I don't
would that be fair, or is that just to sort of the Republican folklore?
This is a little too partisan. I mean,
Well, but I'm just saying, but
No,
it's mostly Republicans who say that. I'm trying to be fair. Fair in the sense that somebody might say what I just said isn't right because it's coming from Republicans.
No.
Putting that aside, whether it's Republican or Democrat, do you think that argument makes sense that Frank and Dodd should have been more supportive of regulation and more oversight over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and maybe we would have had a less severe contraction of the economy?
I think that in general, there was a need for greater oversight and greater demands for accountability and transparency with regard to Freddie and Fannie Mac and with regard to the big players on Wall Street. And I think the problem was that the real problem was packaging these mortgage instruments that everyone now calls toxic, that were backed by subprime mortgages that weren't worth much. Packaging all these things that were filled with tremendous risk so that the balance sheets of these huge institutions on which our banking system and therefore our economy relied, and that's not just Freddie and Fannie Mac, but included Citigroup and Bank of America and Lehman Brothers, were filled with these incredibly weak, incredibly risky assets. And look, it is fundamentally the role of government, I believe, not to be big, but to protect the public interest. And I think that Washington fell down on that, and that a greater push for oversight and protecting the public interest, a greater push for accountability, would have made a difference. And I do agree that that's the truth, whether it's Freddie or Fannie Mac or the institutions on Wall Street. And look,
and whether it's Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, Democrats who were responsible for not reining in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the criticism would remain, is what you're saying. You're not going to be partisan in that sense.
I am not.
You're an equal opportunity employer here.
I am. Let me tell you something. I am a Democrat, but what I have been for the last 11 years is nonpartisan, non-political, and I am an independent person. And I am not going to change my stripes now that I'm running for office. I feel the same way. And you know what? I think the voters of Illinois want that, whether they identify themselves as Democrats or Republicans. They're looking for someone who not only talks about being independent, but has a record of being independent. And I think that that's a fair statement about what I've been fighting for. And I do think that whether it relates to pushing for more oversight or pushing against waste of our tax dollars, and this is especially true for Democrats who believe that government should play a role in improving and enhancing our lives. I don't believe in big government, but if you're a Democrat and you believe that government should play a role, we should be especially vigilant about waste and fraud. And look, $1 wasted by Democrats is still $1 wasted. That's what I believe in, and that's one of the things that I would fight for.
You believe government should play a role, but you don't believe in big government?
Correct.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Do you believe that the private sector is a good competitive market force?
Well, I believe that, of course, it's a good competitive market
you
force.
believe
I don't believe it's perfect.
But do you believe in competition?
Of course.
You think it's beneficial? You
Of
think
course
free
I do.
enterprise is good?
Of course I do.
So if we have a sector like the health sector of the economy that we're trying to improve, there may be a variety of ways in which, as coming out of the University of Chicago, you may notice a lot of people say, Milton Friedman said this, he wasn't in the law school, but he was at the University of Chicago. He said if you trace a problem, any problem, far enough, you find government at the other end. You disagree with Milton Friedman?
I do. I disagree with that.
Okay.
I disagree with that. And I think
But would you agree if he modified and said that often you'll find government at the end? That is, often the government is a source of problems as well as somebody an entity that can do good. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I would agree with that, but I certainly would agree that I would not say that government can solve all problems and that government is always has the right answer. I don't agree with that either. I just think I have a more balanced approach.
But you believe in a public option, right?
I do believe in the public option.
And people would say, should we have a public option in the computer sector? Because we don't, and it seems to work very well. We have all sorts of innovation. Should we have a public option in the phone sector? You know, any kind of cell phone you want, any kind of iPhone, whatever, you get all that innovation through competition, and you get low prices and quality products. It works with phones, it works with computers. Why doesn't it work in healthcare? And why would you be distrustful that, I mean, you might want to do things to make sure there's more competition in the health sector. But free market people might say that's what you should do rather than introduce government and somehow think that they could be a positive force.
You know, not all commodities are created equal. And health is a very different commodity. Our health is a very different commodity than a computer or a phone. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, look, we have been a almost purely private sector system outside of areas like Medicare where people...
Well, that's a major exception.
That people
You would agree in the last 30 or 40 years, healthcare has become, if not dominated by, increasingly regulated, and the government has played an increasingly dominant role in healthcare over the last 40 years.
Well, that may be the case in terms of its role. But I guess what I'm saying
and
is...
it's not gotten any better, so could there be a possible correlation between the two?
Well, that seems simplistic to me. Let me say this. There's no public option now. And people who are arguing against the public option are saying we don't want to introduce government into what currently is a purely private sector affair with regard to that portion of our healthcare.
They're afraid.
Well,
what do you think they're afraid of?
I'm not sure that I would agree that everyone is afraid, but I think that...
But a lot of people are.
Well, here's what I think people are afraid of. I think people are afraid of a system that does not work for just about anybody. Even people who have health insurance now, whether it's through their employers or otherwise. I think there's a tremendous amount of insecurity about whether that health care is still going to be there, whether that health insurance is still going to be there. I think what people are afraid about is that with one or two unlucky steps, they will be cut off. They will be declared by their health insurance company that they will not be covered, that they will find that their out-of-pocket costs are increasing dramatically. That's what I think a lot of the fear is. And then, if you, as Republicans, who care about cutting costs, who care about efficiency, how is it efficient that 46 million people are unemployed, and when they get sick, having not had any preventive care because they can't afford it because they don't have insurance, where do they wind up? They wind up in the emergency room, the most expensive place where we can provide treatment.
But you've, in a sense, isolated the problem. You've referred to 46 million people who are uninsured. You've been referred to people implicitly who may, due to a pre-existing condition, loss of job, otherwise be unable or find it prohibitively costly to continue their health insurance, right? There's sort of two separate groups there. In large, we're just talking, we're talking one University of Chicago grad to another one, right?
That's right.
All right, so we can do that, right?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So we're abstracting, you've identified two major issues. Why not tailor a healthcare program to focus on those two major problems that you've raised, as opposed to redoing the whole healthcare economy?
I don't think that the proposals that are on the table redo the whole healthcare economy, first of all. And second of all, I'd like to see a substitute plan that deals properly with the issue of both people who are not insured and deals with the issue of giving more security to people, deals with the issue of costs. There needs to be some sort of comprehensive plan.
Well,
we're not talking about remaking the health.
Let's take the ones who are uninsured.
Yes.
And people look at this, sometimes they use old studies, current studies, but a large number of those folks are thought, maybe 30, 35 million, are to involve people who probably would be eligible for Medicare or Medicaid but choose not to enroll. They're thought to be a large number of those folks and a large number of others who could access health care but for one reason choose not to. And so a closer examination of those folks and say, is it right that these folks are eligible for government programs but don't choose? And if they don't, then we try to identify what the reasons are. And then maybe you say, well, still, if they choose not to have insurance, if they still choose not to, maybe require it for the reasons you say. At the University of Chicago, we call it a free rider problem. Because they don't get insurance. When something bad happens, they walk into the emergency room. They're very costly to treat. It hurts others who have to pay for it. People who have care admittedly pay for this emergency room service. But so that would be a group of people, and whether I've said it right or wrong, we could just, go back and forth. We won't on the show, but at least focus on those 46 million and what you could do to bring them into the system and make it, if not give them, make it easier for them to access health care. Maybe it's subsidies, maybe it's information, and so forth. And then you turn to the other problems. People with pre-existing conditions might lose a job, might have a heart attack, they're no longer insurable, things of that type. You're still dealing with a relatively small subset of what the 300 million people in this country.
Yeah.
Don't you know?
First of all, I don't agree with that. I don't think it's just people who have pre-existing conditions. I think people's experience with their health insurance companies, even if it's not a pre-existing condition, there's stories, lots of stories, and I think the general feeling is one of insecurity and one of not feeling good about it. This public option, it is an option. It is an option for people, and I think that it's surprising to me that the health insurance companies believe that they're just going to have so much trouble competing with what effectively is a not-for-profit that would be a public option. These are some of the very same arguments that were brought up in the 60s against Medicare and the 30s against Social Security. And what we're talking about here is a much smaller, much less comprehensive type of government involvement than Medicare or Social Security.
But the concern is when the government is backing you up. Look, go back to the housing situation and back to the economy. A lot of people say the problem we had there is that we were socializing risk and privatizing gain. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who were sort of quasi-public private entities, had a lot of people who did very well, and then things went poorly because they knew they were socializing the risk, they were bailed out. But they were able to get funding by lower interest rates because their investors knew they could probably rely on the government to bail them out. So on the healthcare side, people are afraid that a so-called public option, a government entity, will be subsidized in one form or another by the government, whether it's capital infusion or otherwise, and therefore the private companies will be forced to compete with a government entity that's getting subsidized.
I just think it's a false argument. I'll tell you, going back to the banks, if this problem had been isolated to Freddie and Fannie Mac, we would not have had the banking collapse that caused this credit freeze that caused businesses all around the country to contract and lay people off. The reason so many people were suffering, the reason so many jobs were lost, was not because of Freddie and Fannie Mac. It's because businesses all around the country had to contract because they couldn't get credit. And that's because of the banking collapse on Wall Street. So if this problem regarding subprime mortgages and loans was just limited to government-controlled and government-backed entities, yes, there might have been taxpayer bailouts of those two things, which would not have been good, but that problem would have been isolated to those places. Instead, you had the same kind of problems throughout the private sector with not enough oversight, not enough demands that they be held accountable, not enough transparency in the private sector, which the private sector fighting against transparency amazes me.
But there are private people who believe in the private sector who say we have to start believing in bankruptcy. They would say it was a mistake by the feds to bail out AIG, mistake essentially by the feds to bail out Citicorp. And these are things that, again, socialize the risk for these private entities, in addition to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And now we're starting to do the same thing. We haven't really changed the structure, and so for a variety of reasons, partly because of the bailouts, the financial institutions are not quite as in much trouble. But 5 years, 10 years down the road, if the philosophy continues, if you're too big to fail, the government will step in. You're inducing people to become big. You agree with that?
Well,
you're incentivizing becoming bigger than you otherwise should be.
It's a nice theoretical argument to say we believe in bankruptcy, but when letting big institutions fail would have meant moving from a very deep recession where millions and millions lost their jobs to a global depression where even more would have lost their jobs. You know, we had to act. And I believe that was the right thing to do.
We're going to go into other topics,
yes.
But just to finish it out quickly, so while we're on the financial sector, the $800 billion stimulus, you would have voted in support of that when you were there?
You know, what I would have wanted to see more of was demands for independent oversight that would have been able to fight better against corruption and waste within the stimulus funds. There was an article the other day that the estimate of corruption and waste from those funds is around 7%, which is about $50 billion.
And there are others who think it's much larger, and if it's not waste, it's also pork and so forth. People who look at that say there's a very small amount of money, maybe $100 billion of the $800 billion, that's true stimulus infrastructure spending. There's all sorts of other spending that people might like, they might dislike, but it has nothing to do with stimulus. But you disagree. You're saying it's much smaller, and on net, you would have voted for that $800 billion stimulus?
I think that given...
If you had to vote yes or no?
Given how deep our economic problems were, using an economic stimulus package to get people back to work quickly is the right thing to do. And I think you make it temporary, which it is, and you put safeguards in place to make sure that our tax dollars are being protected.
All right. Going over to foreign policy.
Yeah.
You got some experience when you were working for Senator Boren.
Yeah.
That was one of your areas you focused on.
Yes.
The Iraq War. If you had been there in the fall of 2002, would you have voted to authorize the president to take military action?
You know, I don't think I would have. The thing that concerned me most about that at the time was that I would have liked to seen even more efforts to try to get our allies and the international community on board. I know they tried. I know they went to the UN. But looking back on it, with their main argument having been about the weapons of mass destruction, and that having been based on wrong intelligence, and you look at now how our reputation was damaged as much as it was because of the wrong information, because of the rush to get there.
Now we fast forward to September 20, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama has been president now for about 8 months. The number of troops has increased in Afghanistan, I think, by 20 or 30,000. It'll soon be 68,000 in Afghanistan. As you know, there's a proposal apparently on the table for another 30 to 40,000 troops to go into Afghanistan to support a better counter-terrorist activity, counterinsurgency.
Right.
You got to not just acquire area or defend, or you got to make not just areas safe, but you got to allow them to be safe. You know the whole counterinsurgency argument, which apparently some people would say has worked in Iraq, but at tremendous cost.
Right.
Right now, Obama doing the right thing with 68,000 troops, and would you go with him if he came to you as a U.S. Senator and said, I'd like your support for another 20 or 30,000 troops?
Well, he hasn't done that yet. I mean,
but if he does that, would you?
Well, I think
if he made that determination,
the president.
If he did make that determination in the next month or two, and you knew what you knew now, would you be more or less likely to go along with what Obama recommended if he did recommend 20 to 30,000 more troops?
Here's how I would approach foreign policy decisions as a senator. First of all, I do think that whatever party you're in, it is important to be independent-minded and to make up your own mind on decisions, whether the president comes to you or not. Obviously, it's important to take the president's views very, very seriously. I would like, as a senator, I think you are entitled to get that information directly from the military and hear what they have to say. I mean, I think we're all waiting for what General McChrystal has to say with regard to Afghanistan. My concerns with Afghanistan.
But deal with my hypothetical. Let's just assume McChrystal recommends 30,000 troops. That's what we're hearing. Assume Obama goes along with it. He comes to you.
Yeah.
You know what you know now. Do you go with Obama or not?
I'd have some questions. I'd have some questions about. I'd like to hear how the mission is clear and how we can envision accomplishing the mission. How getting 30,000 more troops in there is going to lead to. Because I think they're defining.
So the answer is you're persuadable. If he answered those questions in a good way, in a way that's persuasive to you, gave you the information, you're going with President Obama, additional troops for Afghanistan.
I'm persuadable, but I'm not promising that I would, because I think that we need to be hesitant before we put in our troops anywhere and before we increase the number of troops. And taking the surge rationale from Iraq and applying it to Afghanistan as if it's the exact same situation, I don't believe is correct. I'm not automatically against increasing the number of troops.
Would you have voted for the surge in Iraq when it came up?
I think that was the right answer at that time. I mean, once you're in, and given that situation at that time, I do think that was
So you
right.
disagree with now President Obama on that?
I think
Because he to this day has not said it was a mistake, and he was opposed.
I think, look,
he was opposed to the surge.
I think the surge showed that putting more troops in the right situation allows us to bring our troops back home more quickly and safely.
Free trade. You're a free trader or not?
I generally support free trade, but I again think it's situation specific.
Okay. Would you have supported NAFTA?
I would have supported NAFTA, but let me say how I feel about NAFTA now.
You got to be quick because you only got 5 minutes left.
NAFTA has good enforcement
It's like a
provisions.
UC Law School exam, one you'll be giving soon.
I'll give you the 10-second version. NAFTA has good enforcement provisions in it that haven't been enforced enough. So free trade and opening markets for our industry is good, but making sure that people play the game fairly in terms of our trading partners, we need to do more of that.
All right, but with that provision, you would have supported NAFTA at the time.
I would have supported it at the time. I think we need more enforcement now.
CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement, you would have supported that?
Same thing. I feel that opening up our markets is good for American business and therefore good for American workers, but we need to make sure that the rules are being enforced properly.
Same thing with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, Panama Free Trade Agreement, South Korea Free Trade Agreement, all are being held up now by Barack Obama.
I think it depends on the specifics of those deals.
Card check, yes or no?
I'm in favor of card check because I'm in favor of more democracy in the workplace.
You think card check gives you democracy? It takes something, the private ballot, secret ballot, and makes it open. So you know the examples given. The burly guy stands at the door, says, are you going to go with us or not? And if you say not, you won't sign his little card.
I think there are examples.
That's not exactly the secret ballot that we have in the United States. That's people say that's the bulwark of democracy, and you want to give that up and say for democratic reasons?
I think there are
democratic with a small d.
I think there have been abuses both ways. There could be abuses on the card check thing, but there have been abuses with regard to the secret ballot. What we should have is, and look, I think the right answer is, I don't see why you can't have both or options for both. I would like to see the situation where there are enforcement provisions both with regard to secret ballot and enforcement provisions with regard to card check. But I'll tell you what, theoretically, both can be good about figuring out the will of the workers, and that's what this should be about. But ruling out card check because we're scared about the will of the workers writing things down, I don't agree with.
Would you release your tax returns and your net worth in a heartbeat?
I think I'm going to be doing that with regard to the financial disclosure statement.
But would you do, if somebody says, I want to see your tax returns, do that?
I don't have a problem with that.
Net worth, you'd put it out there and say, my net worth is?
Yes, I think I'm going to be doing that.
And your net worth is?
I don't know approximately what it is, but I'll be giving
500,000, $1 million, $2 million, give me a ballpark.
Well, it's over $1 million, but it's not even anywhere close to where the Giannulli's numbers are. I'm not going to have the same kind of resources that he has.
We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll, but I very much want to thank our guest, David Hoffman, who's running for the U.S. Senate in the Democratic primary. He's mentioned Alexei Giannulli. Real quick, where are you on those loans? We should say David Hoffman should get a lot of credit. Of all the U.S. Senate candidates, Democratic or Republican, he's the first to come in out of the cold and be here.
Thanks.
It was easy to get here. I don't know that you'll get the credit, but you deserve a lot of credit. We don't endorse candidates, but we do endorse the notion that everybody should do what David Hoffman would do. We hope you'll come back soon because we got a lot more to carry. Alexei Giannulli, you know, the family bank loan, Broadway Bank made those loans. People say they're mob ties. What do you say about those loans that were made by Alexei Giannulli's family bank?
Right. I'm talking about myself here. I think every candidate
Well, yes or no, is that a concern? You're a reformer.
I'm telling you.
So people look at that?
We should turn the page on the corrupt politics and cozy relationships of the past. We need to nominate a candidate who doesn't have ties to those things. Every candidate should make their case based on that standard.
Are you saying Giannulli has mob ties?
I'm making the case based on me. I think every candidate should have to.
What about his handling as state treasurer? You know, big losses in the Bright Start Fund. Should he take the hit for that?
I think everyone's got to defend their own work history, and I think that that's relevant. And I think he'll be answering questions about that, and we're all going to be talking about what our records are and why we think it's the best record.
Real quick, cap and trade, you're for that?
I think that's a good plan.
You don't think it's going to be a heavy tax and hurt the economy?
I don't. I think we've got to be leaders in both environmentally solid policies that are good for American business.
Public financing, you favor that?
Of campaigns?
Of campaigns.
I think if we can get to that, I mean, look, we have it in the president's
Some people
race.
say, some of the Democrats especially say, you should have television stations be required to give out free campaign ads. Yes or no?
I think that if you could, the best way to reduce the cost of campaigns.
Free campaign time, buy TVs, yes
discounted.
or no?
Discounted.
Discounted, but not free?
Discounted would get you there.
Like 70%, 30% discount?
I suppose the percentage would have to be figured out, but it's a good
Abortion, you're
reform.
1,000% pro-choice?
I am pro-choice.
Pro-gun control?
I'm pro-law enforcement, and that informs my feelings about gun control. I believe in the Second Amendment right to guns. But
Bring back the ban on assault weapons?
Absolutely.
Same-sex marriage?
I am for it.